Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter at the National Review Institute's Summit on the Future of Conservatism. With us this evening is the editor of the National Review, Mr. Rich Lowery. Rich, thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I guess I should start by saying thanks so much for having us here. Just talk to us about the summit and what you and other conservatives hope to accomplish here.
Well, it's obviously a time of great angst for conservatives. We've just suffered really a historic defeat in the last presidential election, and we need to recommit ourselves to our principles while also retooling some of our policy and some of our messaging. So we're going to try to have a little of that, all of that here at this summit with great conservative thinkers and great conservative politicians talking about, discussing, and debating the way ahead.
Many questioned back in November if conservatism was dead. Can conservatism thrive moving forward, and how do we recruit more women and Latino voters?
Well, I think conservatism has an enduring appeal because its essential axioms are true, and we have a better understanding of human nature and how the world works than the other side. And as Margaret Thatcher said of socialism, eventually you run out of other people's money. That's going to happen to this administration. It's happening already. But the Republican Party's brand hasn't really recovered from 2006 and the serial debacles the Republican Party suffered. The Iraq War going bad, Katrina, and then the financial crisis, which really didn't have anything to do with Republicans or Republican policy per se, but was associated with the party. And that was really led to the current ascendance of the Democrats. I don't think you're going to see Republicans really come back until you see those sort of debacles happen on the watch of the other party, which I think sadly inevitably will happen. But in the meantime, we do need to think about how we broaden our appeal and freshen up our message. And I think conservatives tend to be a little too caught in the 1980s and the glory of the Reagan years. It's absolutely appropriate and right that we revere Ronald Reagan, but doesn't mean that every single policy that he advocated in that time 30 years ago is appropriate now.
So you're saying we need to still carry the Reagan mantle, but at the same time find a new way forward?
Correct. I mean, Ronald Reagan would not, if he were with us right now, he would not be saying exactly all the same things and same policies he was advocating then, because he was a good politician. He wanted to maintain the bedrock principles, fidelity to the Constitution, freedom and liberty and order, but he wanted to really apply them to the problems of the day. And people like my parents, who were Democrats going into the 1980s, they became Republicans because gas lines, we had gas lines, the price of chicken at the grocery store was too high. There are a series of practical problems that Reagan took our principles, applied to them, and came up with practical solutions. And that's what we need to start doing again today.
Let me get your take on some stories making headlines today. This afternoon we learned that a court found that President Obama's labor board appointments were unconstitutional. This is a big setback for the president. Does this decision affirm that the Obama administration has a loose interpretation of the law, in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see more of this because if there's no other function that Republicans in the House can serve, it is as a blocking action on his most ambitious initiatives. So they're going to have to find a way around Congress on a lot of this, which means acting administratively and being as aggressive as they can in interpreting their executive prerogatives. And those appointments were an example of that. We'll see more of it to come.
A recent Gallup poll finds President Obama's fourth year in office was the most polarized in history. On Monday, the president outlined a very progressive agenda in his inaugural address. How do you expect him to govern these next 4 years?
Well, he did everyone the favor of setting out his ambitions in the clearest fashion he could in that inaugural address, because for 4 or 5 years it was all in this post-partisan sheen. A liberal ideology and a post-partisan sheen. He wanted Republicans to go along with him. They didn't. As soon as he gave up on that, we've seen the whole thing exposed, which he really wants to reorient the country, the meaning of the founding, around progressivism. He's hoping Republicans will be splintered and basically curl up and die, and one of the messages coming out of the summit is that's never going to happen.
Now, let's turn to the fiscal fight. Republicans want to replace automatic spending cuts with changes to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Obama and the Democrats are pushing for more revenue. How do you see this playing out, and are we on track for a government shutdown?
Yes, we are. It'll be another last-minute deal. I think, unfortunately, there are limits to what Republicans can get. They might get some more spending restraint, but it's just really hard for them to win these high-profile battles because the president has the bully pulpit. The executive is inherently unified in these sort of fights in a way Congress isn't necessarily, and he has the media on his side. So I think Republicans should push it. They should get as much as they can, but they should just have a realistic sense of how much they can do when they just control the House of Representatives.
Now, during the fiscal cliff debate, congressional Republicans agreed to raise taxes on wealthier Americans, something at odds with the conservative base of the Republican Party. Do you expect the party to continue moderating in this manner instead of taking a hardline approach, and is that wise?
Well, I think the problem with the fiscal cliff and what really predetermined an outcome that no Republicans are really going to be happy with is if nothing happened, and that's sort of the power Republicans have in the House, stopping things from happening. But if nothing happened, taxes were going to go up in a massive way, in a way that Republicans all opposed, in a way they perversely would have been blamed for. So they had to cut a deal, and it ended up being a pretty lousy deal. And it wasn't just tax increases on the higher end. It was a tax increase on 77% of Americans because the so-called payroll tax holiday was disappearing. So they'll have more leverage in the fights to come than in the fiscal cliff showdown. But still, there are limits to how much you can do, as long as you have the one guy in the United States, as Mitch McConnell always says, who has the pen, who can make things law, as opposed to what you want to do.
Rich, you've written extensively about President Obama's gun grab. Senator Feinstein yesterday unveiled an assault weapons ban that outlaws more than 150 firearms. What did you make of this legislation? And if it doesn't pass out of Congress, do you expect the president will unilaterally legislate assault weapons?
I think that would be really hard for him to do, given that he's basically said he can't do it. Now, that didn't stop him with basically taking executive action to implement the DREAM Act, which he had previously said he couldn't do. But I think the assault weapons ban won't get out of the Senate. I think these red state Democratic senators who are up for election will be very reluctant to embrace it. I think the most they'll probably get is a universal background check, which I don't think is a particularly good idea either, because it's unworkable and unenforceable. The tragedy of Sandy Hook, part of the tragedy is nothing anyone is proposing, even the kind of things that I would like to see happen. There's no guarantee that any of them would have prevented it from happening. And when you have a mentally unstable individual that is bent on committing an act of mayhem like this, who doesn't care whether he gets caught and actually may want to die, it's just unfortunately very hard to stop that. And from Columbine on, we've had this kind of sick replication in our culture of targeting schools. And unfortunately, it doesn't look as though it's going to end anytime soon.
Let's turn to immigration real quickly. What do conservatives think about Senator Marco Rubio's immigration plan, and is it becoming popular with conservatives?
Well, he's really working it, and he's doing all that he can to persuade the right. I'm still convinced the right policy is to enforce our immigration laws. First, to enforce at the border, and particularly to enforce at the place of employment with some sort of e-verify system that just makes it extremely difficult for illegal immigrants to get jobs here. Once you did that and you're assured that system was working in a way that would make it much more difficult to have a continued influx from Mexico, then you can talk about what to do with the people who are here and aren't going anywhere. And there will be millions of them, and you'll have to regularize their status eventually.
Last question for you, Rich. Earlier, we talked about the recent presidential election. The GOP has lost the last two presidential elections by putting forth moderate candidates. Turning toward 2016, do you think that the party has to nominate a conservative candidate to win, and who would be on your short list?
Well, I'm always in favor of nominating a conservative. Part of the problem last time is that it wasn't just the strongest raft of candidates, and you had a lot of very potentially compelling candidates sitting it out because the timing wasn't right, or they didn't have the fire in the belly, or they just thought it was too soon. This time we should have a really impressive field of candidates, and we'll hear from some of them here this weekend. Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, Bobby Jindal, I think, has probably been the single most interesting Republican since the election, and what he's been saying and what he's been advocating in terms of the party reorienting itself. So we should, part of the problem was Mitt Romney is just not a very good politician at the end of the day, and if nothing else in 2016, the Republican Party should have just better political horseflesh out there making the run.
Rich Lowery, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.